Marketing strategy is the answer to the two classic strategy questions: where to play and how to win. And those have been the bedrock questions for all companies throughout time.
Welcome to A History of Marketing. I'm Andrew Mittrak, and today we're joined by Professor George Day, a renowned author, educator, and researcher. Day is the Geoffrey T. Boise Emeritus Professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he founded the Mack Institute for Innovation Management. Day co-authored the book Marketing Research with David Ocker and V. Kumar, who were previous guests on this podcast. But Day is perhaps best known for his influential work on marketing strategy. We spend most of this interview on his 1990 book, Market-Driven Strategy: Processes for Creating Value, which was a breakthrough work because it shifted the focus from a company's internal capabilities towards an outside-in, customer-centric approach to marketing and business strategy. And while there are many strategic marketing frameworks that have emerged over the last 30 years, you can trace a lot of them back to the ideas popularized by Day in this book. Now, here's my conversation with Professor George Day. George, thanks so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be able to share my story and reflect on the history of marketing strategy, or what I would call strategy from a marketing perspective.
Sounds great. Well, let's start with the early days of your story. You started as a mechanical engineer.
Correct.
At the University of British Columbia. And in less than a decade, you were teaching to MBA students at Stanford's Graduate School of Business about marketing. So how did you go from engineering to marketing?
It began when I started as a junior engineer in a chemical plant as an operating engineer. I decided that was arduous and painful. So I talked my way into the market development group. I joined the market development group as part of the R&D group. They were trying to find applications for the products they were developing. So we had a lot of capacity to produce hundreds of products. So my job was to find markets for them.
A product in search of a market. That sounds
Yeah.
like a fun, challenging line of work.
So I transferred to headquarters, and the day I arrived, they fired my boss. So there was a two-person market development group, and I was the lead person. So I had to learn a lot very fast. Talk about the blind leading the halt. I was thrust into an environment and a job which I really didn't understand, was certainly not prepared for, because with an engineering degree, I was focused and rigorous. I think a lot of my perspectives came from the questions I asked and the inability of the senior executives of the chemical company to answer them. I decided then to understand better what the situation I was in. I'd get an MBA, and that was a really transformative experience.
Now, were there any professors or mentors during that time that shaped your early views of marketing?
Yeah. I encountered an enormously influential figure in my life who I consider a mentor, David Layton, who subsequently became chair of the American Marketing Association. To illustrate his capacity, he also was brought in to run the Canadian Winter Olympics and became the chairman and managing director of the Canadian Government Library, Symphony, and Museum. So Dave influenced me and encouraged me to go on and get a doctorate. And that's when I went to Columbia. I had a Ford Foundation fellowship that I could use to talk my way into most schools. So I went around and interviewed 3 or 4 schools and selected Columbia largely because of John Howard, who was a rigorous, leading edge scholar. He had an enormous influence on Jagdish Sheth and also for me.
I talked to Jagdish Sheth a few weeks ago, and he spoke about his collaboration with John Howard on developing the theory of buyer behavior. What was your relationship to John Howard, and did you have a chance to collaborate with him on any of your research works?
Jagdish at that time was a research assistant or as an associate of John Howard's, had gone to work with him. I came in as a doctoral student into the doctoral program. It came that I worked very closely with him and ran a big research project, which we called the Buyer Behavior Project. It was a major research collaboration with the General Foods Company.
Oh, wow.
So I spent a lot of time on that. That's where I learned a lot of my research skills.
And did you find that having this engineering background gave you a unique perspective into marketing? Were you sort of an odd person out with an engineering background, or was that more common?
I think the engineering background certainly helped me because in the PhD program at that time at Columbia, there was a real emphasis on rigor and statistics. So that was pretty easy for me. My dissertation was on continuous time, discrete state, stochastic models in marketing. If you can follow that, don't ask me any questions.
I want to jump ahead to 1990. This is when you published Market Driven Strategy Processes for Creating Value. And when we were emailing in advance of this show, you mentioned market driven strategy is a good place to start because that book represents your views on the scope of marketing strategy. So,
Right.
can you share with us what is the scope of marketing strategy?
Marketing strategy, there's various ways to define it. I take an expansive view as the answer to the two classic strategy questions: where to play and how to win. And those have been the bedrock questions for all companies throughout time. But market-driven strategies advocate starting from the market and your previous commitments. That's the nature of your capabilities and culture that shape both the choice of customer value proposition and choice of served market. I think ultimately the core of marketing strategy is how to achieve customer value leadership and continuously innovate new value that customers will pay for. The other side of it is that the companies that win, and I take a strong competitive advantage approach to it, but a lot of my subsequent work for the last 20 or 30 years has dealt with the ability of companies to foresee trends, events, and opportunities, which often come about as weak signals that are flickering out there on the periphery of the organization. The winners detect and act on those weak signals faster than anybody else. At the core of an innovation discipline is the ability to foresee trends and events that create great opportunities or possible great threats and position yourself to capture them ahead of any of your rivals.
I love how you frame it as where to play and how to win. And as I was researching this book and your work, unlike a lot of books on marketing strategy that can feel kind of esoteric and abstract, this one feels really grounded in real world business applications. How much of this was sparked by your academic research versus being informed by your experience hands on consulting for companies?
That's a very insightful question, and the answer is both. Because I am a product of case background, I use a lot of cases, and at the time I got my degree at the University of Western Ontario, It was strongly influenced by the Harvard Business School emphasis on cases. I love cases, and I love teaching cases, and the cut and thrust of the dialogue, debate in the classroom is really energizing. I take a little detour there in order that you can understand how I came about and developed my consulting practice, which was largely as a leadership facilitator. So I had maybe 100 engagements where a company would come in and I would only work with the division general manager or the CEO. That was my client, but we would agree that it was my meeting. And so I treated them literally as live cases. My job was to identify the critical issues and get everybody to agree, that is, everybody on the leadership team, to agree these were the top 5 issues, and then come up with an action plan. We would not stop the meeting until there was a detailed action plan, assigned individuals, dates, and times when they would deliver it. I made myself extremely unpopular by dragging meetings out until I'm satisfied and the CEO is satisfied. You're not going anywhere. But more importantly, Andrew, these were ultimately live cases.
Great. So these live cases, who you were consulting with, these were some of the best-known companies in the world: AT&T, Ford, Nike, IBM, Cisco, Coca-Cola, Best Buy, JCPenney, Wells Fargo, dozens of others. I could go on. And you mentioned that you were often working with the full executive team, not just a marketing department, but your main client was the CEO. And even though you're known as a marketing professor, or marketing was in your title or is your focus, this market-driven strategy, is beyond the scope of just the marketing department at an organization. You're
Oh,
you're working with the
absolutely.
full leadership team.
No, I take a comprehensive, integrated view of the organization and how it can compete in the future.
So back to market-driven strategies, you write about some of the common misconceptions about market-driven strategies. The first that you cite is that some people misinterpret it as being reactive to the market. I'm going to quote your book here.
Yep.
The real gains from being market-driven come from anticipating market opportunities and getting to them ahead of rivals. So to be market-driven, companies can drive the market and even create new markets where they didn't exist.
You mentioned the distinction between market-driven and market driving. To me, that's a distinction without a difference. Uh, in that a market-driven organization is constantly looking over the horizon out as far as 3 to 4 years and trying to anticipate from the market back what the big threats and potential opportunities are. But that's my philosophy about the marketing function, is the interface function between the organization and its markets, defined by collaborators, competitors, customers, and consumers. One of my jobs as a facilitator going back was to force them looking at their company through the eyes of their customers and competitors. I would get them to role play their major competitor. I would flip the script and have, for example, the chief operating officer take the role of his counterpart. Ditto the operations manager and the marketing director and the CEO. So they all got into their roles. Then I would get them to play out a role as though they were the leadership team of their major rival and think about the moves they would make. That's an example of outside in thinking.
No, that sounds like a lot of fun. I often, on a marketing team, I take a somewhat similar approach of trying to role play being a customer that uses a competitor's product.
That's precisely it.
One of the other misconceptions that you write about regarding market-driven strategies is around adopting a customer focus. You describe customer focus as a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Right.
So it doesn't mean giving all of your potential customers everything they could potentially want. You write, and I quote, market-driven firms achieve superior profits by selectively nurturing the customers with the highest profit potential.
Exactly. So there's two aspects to what I consider to be a market-driven strategy. That is, think like a customer and always benchmark yourself against your major competitor. So I consider customer value to be a relative concept.
Right, exactly.
The customer picks the one that delivers the most value, whether it's price value, relationship value, quality.
Right. I'm reminded of that Henry Ford quote that might be apocryphal about if I had asked customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. That somebody could, read the title of market driven strategy and think without reading the substance and taking the message, thinking, oh, you gotta, think of the horse market or think of how to build the fastest one. We're not realizing, well, truly being customer centric is understanding the jobs to be done, understanding what it is they really want at the end of the day, and building products that satisfy
Exactly.
their needs, even if it means going to a new market or building a new product.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's adopting the customer's perspective.
One of the themes of the book and your work more broadly is this idea of path dependency. So, can you elaborate on this notion of path dependency and what it means for marketing strategy?
We are dependent on our past choices. There's the old saying, past is prologue. We are constrained by our past choices, our culture, the capabilities we be, and the market positions. But those are also strengths that we can leverage and can adapt. So the ultimate question for all organizations is what's coming next? And how do we position ourselves with our capabilities and our culture to capture the value that's created?
When it comes to market driven strategy, and when you first released this and published this book, did you have any favorite stories of companies that adopted this mindset, that successfully implemented market driven strategies to turn their product lines or their business around?
I got lots of those stories, but I'm going to jump to my favorite long term client. I have been running a think tank for Sonoma County wine growers. Sonoma County wine growers was my laboratory to put all these ideas into play. Sonoma is the second largest wine growing region in the world after Bordeaux, and it's enormously complex. So I'm looking at all the strategic issues that affect them: regulations, changing political climate, changing markets, distribution methods. Obviously, immigration and worker policies are huge. Now we're working with the president, who's a real visionary in designing the farm of the future. So I'll frame this aspiration as part of the overall perspective on strategy. So strategy is about the choices, markets, and directions, but it's also about your level of aspiration and ambition. So their ambition is to be the Silicon Valley of farming, using advanced technology, mechanical pickers, on and on. And we have a lot of investments in generative AI because if you put a sensor in every square meter, that's an enormous amount of data. So I love looking over the horizon and saying, okay, what's coming next? And how are we going to prepare for that?
By the way, I love that example because you're taking wine, which is one of the oldest consumables ever, but you're talking about applying generative AI to it, applying robotics to picking, and the innovation story and the market strategy portion of it just never ends.
Yeah, absolutely hit the nail on the head there.
So,
When you look back on market-driven strategy, where do you think it sits within the evolution of business strategy overall? Because as I was researching it, for me, it felt like a direct predecessor of The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. You talk about the idea of market leaders and their advantage erosion from new entrants, and which sounds a lot like disruptive innovation. So I guess where do you think of it kind of sitting within the overarching arc of how business strategy has evolved?
I see market-driven strategy or strategy from the outside in as interchangeable terms that reflect on the progress of the organization in satisfying its multiple stakeholders, including anticipating technology changes. So I knew Clay pretty well, and it was a tragic loss when he passed away. But I think market-driven strategy is a much broader concept than disruptive innovation because it certainly feeds it and is a valuable perspective. But technology, trends, developments are only one factor in the evolution of a strategy.
Absolutely. Well, Professor George Day, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and wisdom with us today. The time just flew by. I wish we had more time together.
Oh, yeah.
Where would you direct listeners who want to learn more about your work?
So I wrote a subsequent book with a colleague of mine, Paul Schumacher, called See Sooner, Act Faster. That is literally a manifestation of outside in thinking. Not only does it require you to take the perspective of competitors of various kinds, but understand market evolution and position the organization. Ultimately, it's all about leadership. That's the defining message of my experience.
Well, I'll post a link to See Sooner, Act Faster, along with market driven strategy in the blog and the show notes with this podcast. So, George, thanks so much for speaking with us. I had a lot of fun.
Well, I hope we can continue this conversation.
Yes,
Thank you, Andrew.
absolutely.
I really appreciate you taking the initiative to do this and bring us all together.
A History of Marketing is written and produced by me, Andrew Mittrak. If you'd like new episodes delivered right to your inbox, visit marketinghistory.org. There you can also find transcripts of every conversation, including helpful links, images, videos, and other blog posts about marketing history. You can send me an email at hello@marketinghistory.org. If you'd like to support A History of Marketing, consider leaving a review on your favorite podcasting app, or better yet, tell a friend about the show. Thanks for listening.